We arrive in Warsaw in early September and begin by walking from our hotel to the Old Town and the Royal Palace to see Da Vinci's famous painting, Lady with an Ermine. We are not disappointed, for the painting is exquisite. Along the way, we encounter a rally or parade of sorts. The old Rolls Royces were nice, but the rare 50s Mercedes Gullwing was the best in this show. Warsaw's Old Town is not really old. During World War II, the Nazis destroyed 85% of Warsaw, including almost all of the Old Town. It is an outstanding example of a near total reconstruction. Constructed in the 17th century, this well-guarded palace now serves as the official home of the Polish president. Alongside the University of Warsaw is the Carmelite Church, with its neoclassical style facade added in the 18th century. Frédéric Chopin played his first organ recital here. This monument is to Adam Mickiewicz. He was a 19th century poet who is honored as a patriot and as the national poet of Poland. After the Warsaw Uprising of 1944 against the Nazi occupiers, in which over 200,000 civilians were killed, Hitler ordered the systematic destruction of Warsaw. The Old Town was at the top of the list. The Royal Palace was later reconstructed at an incredible cost. Since the 14th century, it has served as the residence of Polish kings, then of the president, and then of the parliament. Today it is a museum and the pride of Warsaw. This young tourist is enjoying the oldest part of Warsaw with its cobblestone streets and unique and varied architecture. In front of the palace is a statue of King Sigismund. It stands on a 70-foot column erected in 1664. It was toppled by a Nazi tank shell, but resurrected in 1949. King Sigismund made Warsaw the capital of Poland. The Old Town is situated on an embankment overlooking the Vistula River. It is Poland's longest river, flowing from the Carpathian Mountains in the south to the Baltic Sea in the north. The Palace Square, with its cafes, shops, and street vendors, attracts tourists and locals alike. Adjacent to the castle square is St. Anne's Church, with a viewing tower considered the best in Warsaw. Onder, our Czech guide, leads us to Wilanów Palace, a priceless testimony to the splendor of Poland's past. The palace was built by the Polish king John Sobieski in the 17th century. The majestic gate, with statues of the Roman gods Mars and Pax, or War and Peace, reflects the military aspects of importance to the king. The palace architecture is a merger of European art and Polish tradition, but seems to favor the decorative Baroque motif. The palace has somehow survived the time of Poland's partitions and both world wars. The palace contains a museum dating to 1805 and provides a remarkable insight into the extravagance and opulence afforded the ruling class. John Sobieski was known as a great soldier who led a European coalition against the Turks in 1683 in the liberation of Vienna. These coffin portraits were unique to Poland. They were placed at the head of the coffin in order to view the mourners. The museum contains many portraits of important people in its history. This beautiful staircase has the appearance of wood, but is actually cast iron. The many magnificent ceilings were painted by various famous European artists. This ceiling designer had a sense of humor, with a lady's legs seeming to come through from above. The palace rooms were filled with impressively beautiful period furnishings, while the elaborate woodwork, sculptures, and ceiling frescoes were magnificent. The Crimson Room was a bedroom and study. In the Grand Crimson Room, the walls are decorated with European paintings collected by Stanislav Potocki. The room contains French furniture inlaid with semi-precious stones and 2 livery coats of 17th century domestic staff. This remarkable portrait of Stanislav Potocki was painted by Jacques David in the late 18th century. Potocki became the owner of the palace in 1799. Often referred to as the Polish Versailles, it was passed down through several aristocratic clans and was privately owned as late as 1939. These furnishings date to the mid-18th century. Although the Nazis removed the furnishings during the war, they were later recovered and returned. These doors were for use by the servants. Beautiful porcelain objects from Europe and Asia were throughout the palace. Inside and out, the art and architecture of Wilanów Palace conveys a sense of royal grandeur. A short distance from Wilanów Palace is Lasinski Park. Our first stop is a statue of Joseph Pilsudski, a revolutionary against the Russian Empire in his younger years. He is credited with Poland's regaining its independence in 1918 and became the first Polish chief of state. The monument to Chopin is in the Art Nouveau style. Frequent concerts featuring his music are held during the summer months in the park. Constructed in the 18th century, this little palace has gently curving wings and roof lines. Built by a Polish nobleman in the 17th century, the palace on the water became the residence of King Poniatowski in the late 18th century. He was the last king of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Numerous peacocks call this palace home. A short walk from the palace is the Roman-inspired amphitheater built in the late 18th century. The stage, sited on an island, was modeled after the ruins of the Roman Forum. Back in Old Town, we try to imagine the replication of these destroyed mansions from photographs and drawings. The rubble from the Nazi bombings was sifted for reusable decorative elements, such as this galleon. St. Anne's classicist facade dates from 1788, and miraculously, unlike the interior, survived the Nazi destruction. The reconstructed interior is in the high Baroque style. Because it is small, they use mirrors to make it appear larger. A short walk from the palace is Market Square. In the center is a statue of Sirena. The mermaid is the symbol of Warsaw. The Barbican was built in 1548 and is located where the old and new towns merged. The new town was founded in 1402 because of excessive population growth. Madame Curie's birthplace in the new town is now a museum. This monument to the Warsaw Uprising against the Germans depicts a group of insurgents retreating into the sewers and another group engaged in battle. The Uprising Museum contains hundreds of artifacts ranging from weapons used by the insurgents to love letters to videos of the street fighting, in order to accurately recreate the atmosphere and events of the struggle of 1944. The insurgency lasted just 63 days, but the tragic toll included the deaths of 16,000 members of the Polish resistance and some 200,000 civilians. In 1940, over 400,000 Jews were forced to live in the Warsaw Ghetto. These few buildings on Prasna Street are the only original residential buildings. In 1940, over 400,000 Jews were forced to live in the Warsaw Ghetto. As many as 100,000 died in the ghetto from starvation and disease. Nearly 300,000 were killed in concentration camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka. There were only 11,500 survivors. For 4 months in 1943, the few remaining Jews offered the first armed resistance to the Germans. They were defeated, and the Germans systematically destroyed the ghetto buildings. The front of the memorial seen here honors the Jewish resistance fighters. This side of the monument depicts a line of Jews marching to their death in a concentration camp. In the Jewish section, we encounter a rehearsal of Fiddler in Polish. At dinner, we enjoyed traditional music and dancing. On the way to Krakow, we stop in Czestochowa to visit the Pauline Monastery of Jasna Góra. Here is the home of the Black Madonna, a Polish and Catholic icon. Let's meet some of our group. Isabel and Joan are from Toronto, eh? We all know Barbara and Ander. Here we have Dorothy and John. At the entry to the basilica is this beautiful mosaic showing the Black Madonna. Father Simeon was our guide and comic relief. The nave of the basilica is currently under construction, or rather restoration. The Black Madonna, a holy icon of the Virgin Mary and the Christ Child, is both Poland's holiest relic and one of the country's national symbols. There are numerous legends concerning the Madonna, and thousands of Polish Catholics make a pilgrimage here every year. The side chapels are also lavishly decorated. The chapel of the Black Madonna is filled with pilgrims and other worshippers. We follow Father Simeon through the chapel. The Black Madonna was originally painted with tempera, but damage caused by later restoration attempts has made it impossible to date the icon. Legend has it that the Black Madonna was painted on a piece of the tabletop from the home of the Holy Family. This professional reproduction shows how the Black Madonna looks underneath the gold and jeweled case used in the chapel. From Czestochowa, we traveled to the combined Nazi concentration camps of Auschwitz and Birkenau. The slogan at the entrance to Auschwitz reads, "Work makes one free." Between 1940 and 1945, over 1.3 million people came here, and 1.1 million died, the vast majority in the gas chambers. The buildings are well preserved and the grounds nicely landscaped. But the more you see, the more you know it was not that way 65 years ago. The entire camp is a sacred ground, as the ashes from the crematoria has covered the area. Approximately 900,000 were exterminated in gas chambers at Auschwitz and Birkenau, while 200,000 died of starvation, forced labor, disease, individual executions, and medical experiments. In Building 4, there is a memorial with an urn holding human ashes. It is among some of the most chilling exhibits. At the end of the courtyard is the death wall, where prisoners were shot to death. On the left is Building 10, where women and children prisoners were experimented on by German doctors. The two posts are where prisoners, with their hands tied behind their backs, were hung by their hands from the post. On the right is Building 11, referred to as the death block, where prisoners were tortured or starved to death. Behind this door is a standing cell, so called because it was only big enough for 4 men to stand. In the basement were the starvation cells. This memorial is dedicated to those who died in these starvation cells. The electrified fences surrounding the camp carried over 10,000 volts. One of the earliest gas chambers and crematorium was here at Auschwitz. The vents in the ceiling of this gas chamber are where the cyanide gas pellets were dropped on the unsuspecting prisoners. In 1941 and 42, some 60,000 prisoners were killed here. The gassing was moved to Birkenau with its more efficient system. Adjacent to the gas chamber was this crematorium. There are no words to describe this scene. A short distance from Auschwitz is Birkenau. A replica of this railroad entry into the camp was used in the movie Schindler's List. On this side was the women's camp. Originally intended to handle the overflow from Auschwitz, it claimed more victims than any other German extermination camp. Upon arrival, the Jews were selected as workers or for gassing. At one point, they were capable of gassing and cremating more than 20,000 people a day. At the end of the war, the Germans destroyed almost all of the camp in an effort to cover up the Holocaust. Some of the men's barracks have been reconstructed. This building housed the latrines. This building had a heating system, but it is doubtful it was ever used. Four to 6 adult males slept on each rack. The Holocaust remains a poignant reminder of man's inhumanity to man. In Krakow, we begin with a walking tour to Wawel Hill, where the first rulers of Poland resided. Krakow is one of the oldest cities in Poland, dating to the late 8th century. It became the first capital of Poland in 1038. Beyond the defensive wall is the Renaissance palace we will visit today. This splendid residence was begun in the 16th century by King Sigismund I. This memorial is dedicated to the 22,000 Polish officers and officials massacred by the Russians in Kechin in 1940. Wawel Hill is located along the Vistula River. It is formed of limestone and thus has many caves. Legend has it that a dragon once lived in these caves. I think he is about to barbecue 2 unsuspecting tourists. At the top of Wawel Hill is the palace and cathedral complex. Sigismund's chapel with the gold dome houses his tomb and those of his children. On this chilly and gray morning, we stop for a cappuccino. The palace was the royal residence, as well as the seat of government. The Renaissance construction, with this beautifully arcaded courtyard, is impressive. The Renaissance wooden ceilings are all original, but most of the elaborate friezes have been restored. The carved heads placed in the ceiling of the envoys' room date to the 16th century. They capture varied psychological expressions. The paintings and other works of art are exquisite. Perhaps its greatest treasures, however, are the more than 700 tapestries. More than 130 tapestries were commissioned from Brussels in the 16th century by King Sigismund Augustus. There is also an extensive collection of Turkish, Caucasian, and Persian carpets and wall hangings. This tapestry contains Sigismund's crest and initials. Wawel Cathedral was first constructed in the 11th century. The current edifice dates to the 14th century. It was the coronation site of nearly all Polish monarchs. The crypt below the cathedral holds the tombs of most Polish kings and national heroes. Our tour continues from Wawel Hill through the ancient streets to the market square. Enjoyed the street musicians.
I don't think you are. I know you are.
Walking along the cobblestone street, we passed the former residence of Pope John Paul II when he was the Krakow Archbishop. Along the Royal Way, we come to a small square with a statue on a column of a Jesuit priest, and an interesting tree. Across the square is the Church of St. Peter and Paul. Originally a Jesuit church with its impressive Baroque facade, it has 12 stone, larger-than-life statues of the 12 apostles. Next door is the oldest church in Krakow, St. Andrew's. It was built in the 11th century in the Romanesque style. People watching is always in style. The residences and shops have a style of their own. Poland is known for its vodka, and liquor stores abound. We arrive at the huge medieval square and look past the Church of St. Adalbert on our right to the majestic St. Mary's Basilica. The highest tower reaches 262 feet, and on every hour a trumpeter plays a 5-note Polish tune to commemorate the famous 13th century trumpeter who was shot with an arrow while sounding the alarm of an attack on the city. The hushed interior is vibrant with color under a starry blue vaulted ceiling. Highly ornate and extravagant in style, It is the epitome of Baroque. The undisputed highlight of the interior is the magnificent 15th century wooden altarpiece by the master carver Stoss. Incorporating more than 200 carved polychrome figures, the panels depict Mary's life from Annunciation to Assumption. The triptych is 13 meters high and 11 meters wide when open. It took Stoss 12 years to make it. St. Adalbert's Church was built in the 11th century, 100 years before the square. In the center of the square is Cloth Hall. It is fronted by yet another statue of the bard Adam Mickiewicz. Cloth Hall has been a market for merchants since the Middle Ages. Carriages offer a relaxing way to tour the main square of the city. The market square is awash with people. I wonder which one is more tired. The Barbican was erected in the 15th century. It is topped by 7 turrets. This monument is dedicated to those who fought in the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, one of the greatest medieval battles. Near Krakow, we visit the salt mines. They have operated since the 13th century, but commercial mining was discontinued in the 90s due to low salt prices and mine flooding. In the mine, there is a large cathedral that can be reserved for private functions. Everything here was carved by miners, 4 actually, who were self-taught artisans. The rock salt is naturally gray, in various shades, and the carvings resemble unpolished granite. Even the floors are carved. The chandeliers are carved of processed salt to give them a translucent appearance. Over the centuries, visitors have included Copernicus, President Clinton, Pope John Paul II, and this group of coalition forces. The mine reaches a depth of 1,000 feet, and its passages are nearly 200 miles long. Saint Barbara, seen here, is the patron saint of miners. We are in the heart of the Old Jewish Quarter on Soroka Street. No longer a synagogue, Poppers dates back to 1620. Its architecture is of the Baroque period, but rather austere. The Rimu Cemetery dates to the 16th century. The plaque on the rock is dedicated to the martyrdom of 65,000 Jews from Krakow murdered by the Germans. Barbara and Martin have been looking for the Shiva, but to no avail. Once a separate town, the Kazimierz Quarter was the center of Jewish religion, culture, and learning. The numerous cafes and restaurants are aimed at tourists, but emphasize Jewish traditions in a tasteful and dignified manner. The Rimu Synagogue was founded in the 16th century and is active today. Commonly referred to as the Old Synagogue, it dates to the 15th century and is now a museum of Jewish culture. When the Nazis moved the Jews from the Jewish quarter to the ghetto, most worked in the adjacent factories. Oskar Schindler owned this factory and is credited with saving the lives of over 1,000 Jews who would have otherwise been exterminated. The factory is now a wonderful museum. This exhibit contains metal tableware made at the factory. Jews in the Krakow ghetto had to wear armbands with the Star of David. Unfortunately for the Poles who survived the German occupation, they were to experience Stalin, a dictator more ruthless than Hitler. It has certainly been well worthwhile to experience even a little of Poland's unique and storied history. We departed Krakow for Eger in eastern Hungary. Our drive takes us across the high Tatras Mountains of the Carpathian Range. The Tatras are the only alpine-type mountains in Poland and are shared with Slovakia.